Well, welcome in, everybody. Really excited that you guys are joining us. Alyssa Orange here with Big Trail Nation in Fayetteville, Arkansas, covering the Razorbacks. We have Matt Roberts in Waco, who covers Baylor, but also Texas A&M, Drew Carter, who is in Birmingham, covering Alabama and Auburn. And then, of course, Brian Holland in Baton Rouge, covering the defending national champions, LSU. So news today that the SEC is going to allow student athletes to come back and work out voluntarily on June 8th. Quickly, let's get everybody's reaction to that date. There's a lot of talk here. It was going to be the 1st or the 15th. The 8th is kind of surprising for me, and it might be just because Phil Fulmer over at Tennessee didn't want guys back on the 1st, and so maybe this was their compromise. That's kind of how I saw it, but what did you guys react?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. I mean, we're fortunate to speak to Ross Bjork every 2 weeks. He holds a press conference, and I mean, he's kind of been right on with this thing from the beginning. He's said that there's a lot that's changing and everything's going to have to evolve. But, you know, he's also said, you know, when he doesn't know the answer to a question, he doesn't know. And I think that was what a lot of this was going into it. I think that, you know, the uncertainty of, you know, what it looks like when you bring players back to campus. I think maybe giving them that extra week from June 1st to June 8th, I think was a compromise that, you know, allows them to get back to campus, get to work in a voluntary setting. And then, you know, allow them to go through there, but giving them that little bit of extra time to get back to work, I think kind of placates to everybody, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. And I think one of the cooler elements of how this whole process has unfolded is seeing guys like a Ross Bjork in a position of power being humble enough to say, I don't know right now, because it's such uncharted territory. And we look to those guys and we say, you must have all the answers, right? I mean, if there's any place we can get an answer, it is a guy like Ross Bjork. And for you, Brian, I remember watching Scott Woodward on the Coach's Caravan, I think, and he was pretty gung-ho saying, like, we're going to play in the fall. We don't really know what's going on right now. We don't know what even tomorrow looks like, let alone a few months from now. But his optimism was really contagious. And I think it's been the same way for most SEC ADs.
I think Scott and Ross Bjork, obviously, they've been kind of the leaders in this. And I also think that going at June 8th instead of June 1st, you're not going for the candy in the bowl right away from a PR perspective, right? Mm-hmm. You're giving yourself one more week to see the Bundesliga, see some, you know, these NASCAR, some of these other entities kind of work out maybe some of the kinks. And when is more information not a good thing? They're gathering more and more information. We're learning each week just a little bit more about COVID-19. So they're getting back soon, but they're gonna allow just one more week, June 8th, the return date.
I think one of the biggest questions that I had personally about it was what they're going to do with these student athletes. They're going to have to probably test them. There's going to be a lot of cleaning. But for Arkansas, for example, you can come in, the state is open, unless you're in a hotspot being like New York or, you know, Baton Rouge or New Orleans. But Baton Rouge is right down the street from New Orleans. We've got athletes who are from the state of Louisiana, and as I'm sure all of you do, you're going to have student athletes coming from these hotspots. So what do the schools do with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that's what that extra week allows you to do. I know that when we talked to Ross this week, you know, they have a comprehensive plan in place on what it looks like when they show up. You know, they test them before they go to the facilities. They test them once they're there working out. Then they test them, you know, monitor them not necessarily test, but monitor them for symptoms and make sure that, you know, they're socially distancing while they're in working out in the weight rooms. I mean, A&M's athletic facilities, just like, you know, pretty much everywhere in the SEC, are just out of control. And Ross was telling us on Tuesday, he's like, look, we got 4 weight rooms. So like we can handle bringing these people back, doing this safely, and having people there to, you know, get people back to work. And you know, you have the support staff that can go in there and can sanitize equipment, that can make sure these guys are taken care of. You know, so I think they have been, you know, speaking from A&M's perspective, they've been waiting for this point, and they've been working, you know, with the information they've had plans that have evolved and have changed as we've learned more about the virus. And now that, okay, it's getting ready to get back to action, they've been planning for this. And I think that they'll be ready on June 8th when they can start allowing, you know, kids back to working out.
Mm-hmm.
And another really interesting element of that is one of the questions around all sports, not just college football, has been, what do you do when one of these players tests positive? Because it feels like that's inevitable. And so somewhat buried in the press release from the SEC was the fourth bullet point out of 5 like extra notes was immediate isolation of team members, quote, under investigation or who have COVID-19. And I thought that was so interesting because that's been one of the money questions is what do you do when one of these players tests positive or a coach or a member of the support staff? I love to see that it's not, let's shut everything down, let's go back to isolation, and then we'll bring it back in a couple of months. Instead, it was an immediate isolation, and then we'll kind of go from there. That seems like a more measured approach to me, and I was kind of happy.
And LSU, I mean, they started a task force when all of this happened. So you talk about the SEC and these grand facilities, and now they have their personal chefs, and there's a whole building, the nutrition center there for LSU on campus. They're attacking it like this is almost like giving the student athletes the best of the best. So when you go into the living room with mama, you can also say not only do we have the best facilities, we've got the best reaction to what was something I don't think any of us ever saw coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know where all of your programs stood with spring football, but Arkansas never stepped on the field. And unlike LSU that just won a national title, Arkansas has a brand new head coach in Sam Pittman, a brand new staff. They have a quarterback in Felipe Franks who transferred over from Florida, has been looking at a playbook for Kendall Briles, but has never actually practiced under Kendall Briles. I mean, if any school needs some practice, it's Arkansas right now. What do you think that the SEC could do maybe down the road with these teams that didn't have a spring practice?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Obviously, the coaches that we've talked to, I mean, whether it's Dave Aranda at Baylor, whether it's, we haven't talked to Jimbo, but, talking to even some of the NFL head coaches of the Texans, we talked to them earlier this week, and they were saying that they can even, you want to have your players on the grass, and there's really nothing that can replace that. But you do get, they said they could get to graduate level details on some of these installs and some of these new facets of the game, whereas maybe in traditional times, maybe it's something you skip over. So I think there's an opportunity there for these coaches to, maybe it's a little bit tougher at the college level because you are dealing with 18 to 22-year-old kids to get them to stay engaged the whole time. But I think that there are certain things you can do, and just I think the schools, because really, what does the time frame look like in terms of getting back on the grass? I think you get on the grass, you're ready to go for August. I think maybe the onus is probably on the schools and the coaches at this point to do as much as they possibly can before they get on the grass, and do as much install as they can, classroom type stuff, so that when they do get on the grass, they can get to the more of the fast paced stuff. I know that's something that Dave Aranda, we talked to him here at Baylor as well. That's something that they've focused a lot on is hitting the details hard, working on these installs, and just really, it's not a great situation, but just making the most out of what you've got.
Yeah, Matt, Coach Saban said something similar earlier this week, which is it gives you more of a chance to focus on the mental side of preparing for a season. You're thinking, like you said, 18 to 22-year-old kids, these guys are probably pretty fired up to get out there and hit someone. But when you can't do that and you have to stay at home and you're just working on the installs via Zoom, you kind of have to spend more time focusing on that. So I thought that was really interesting. And Alyssa, you said with Arkansas, this is basically the worst program something like this can happen to, with a new coach and a new quarterback. With Alabama, they probably don't miss a beat. Saban is all about the process. His process is still intact. He says that basically 2 days after every sport got shut down, he had a process for Zoom. He got on email, which he had never done before. He started texting people occasionally. So Saban is probably like the gold standard, shockingly, even though he's in his late 60s and this is all technical. He's still the gold standard for how he's handling this. So Alabama and probably Auburn too, just because Gus has been there for so long, they're probably going to be just fine.
My question is,
LSU is installing a new quarterback. Joe Burrow isn't just returning. They only got 3 practices in. So I think, Alyssa, you bring up a really good point as far as, how do they backtrack? And if something happens when they do come back and they lose some more time, then what happens then? Do they go back and still reward some of those spring practices and maybe make it up somehow?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think Saban seems to me like a guy that might sign his text messages because he's kind of new to this game, so he like types it out and puts Saban at the end just to let you know.
He's definitely got sent from my LG Mobile at the end of every one of his texts. Yeah.
Well, Sam Pittman's up here still running hand notes, so there's that as well. So
Goes a long way.
Something to be said for that.
yeah, do you guys think with the way things are progressing right now, obviously this is a prediction, that we start on September 5th?
Yeah, I think we do. In what capacity? In terms of, I think there will be play on the field. The question to me comes at, are fans there? Because I think a lot of, and Ross has maintained that they want to play with fans. They feel like that is a part of the experience. Why you go to a place like A&M is to experience the football games. And so they are going to do everything they possibly can to play games with fans. Now, will they be able to? I don't know. But I think a lot of the talk last week, it's Groundhog Day. I don't remember which week is which at this point. But I think it was last week there was starting to be some noise that the Pac-12 was thinking about just doing all conference games. And then, the Cal State system came out and said, no, we're not doing in-person classes. It's all going online. And so that kind of got everybody thinking, okay, well, A&M plays Colorado week 3. They play Fresno State in October. What does that mean? Well, Ross spoke to both athletic directors, and he told us on Tuesday that they both said, we're coming. Like, we're coming to Kyle Field. We are planning to play. And at that point, he talked about, you take them at their word. They're on the ground there. They're looking at these things. And so they're planning to play. I think, in Waco, I think they're expecting, July as a time when things can start getting back to normal in this part of the world. And so I think, who knows if that actually comes to pass, but I think getting them back to campus is a good first step. All the coaches that I've talked to in several sports have said that's a good first step, getting them back to working out so that once, July and August start to roll around, you can start working out. You can have these processes in place. So you start in September. And then I think you start in September and then, Jesus, take the wheel. Let's see what happens.
My immediate takeaway today, guys, to this news was it feels so good to finally hit a target. It feels like every day with sports, all we're doing is we're kicking the can down the road. And it seemed like that was what was going to happen with this date, again, with the SEC saying everything will be closed until the end of May. That's been the threshold for the last 2 months. And just because of how my brain has been rewired in this whole pandemic, I was thinking, well, that's just a placeholder. Like, it's only a matter of time until they push that back. But no, finally, we've got some good news, and we've got UFC coming back, and we've got soccer coming back, albeit in Germany, but it's still coming back. We've got Korean baseball. Finally, the wheels are kind of spinning here. And Matt, I'm glad you brought up the Pac-12 because Alabama plays USC week 1. And that has been really under a lot of speculation ever since. Now, USC is a private school, but ever since the Cal State system came out and said no in-person classes, that has been under fire. And Greg Byrne, as recently as this week, went on radio in Tucson, and he said, that game is on. As of now, nothing has changed. And so, again, optimism. People are excited for college football to come back, and it seems like we're trending in that direction.
Yeah, and the LSU interim president spoke to the board of supervisors here at LSU actually today after this news broke, and he said, look, student athletes are coming back on campus, but it's going to be with very stringent health protocols. So we're going to do this the right way. And I think that inspired a bunch of the well, this was actually in Alabama, but the Coach O gifts of we're coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I just think, a lot of the things that Ross has been telling us throughout this whole process, his attitude, I tell you, I love his press conferences every 2 weeks because they fire me up. I leave and I'm like, all right, like we're going to have football, like we're going to, but his attitude throughout this whole thing has been, hope is not a strategy, but it is an attitude. And I think they have been going about this preparing for football to start on time. And so they are, he said, okay, football starts this date. When do the players have to be on the field and start working out in order to safely start the season? And then you go backwards from there. And then, it has to kind of fit in that window. And I think this announcement today allows that window to be open to where, okay, let's start football in early September.
We've been really patient here in Fayetteville, heard a little bit from Hunter Yurchek, but it's been a very much like, we're going to wait and see. We're going to wait and see. We're going to hope and see. And we've really been following Notre Dame as we all talk about big time openers. Week 2 for Arkansas is Notre Dame, and as an independent, they've had a lot to say. So it's been really interesting to watch them and see what they've done. And now that they say that they're going to have students back and that they're going to hope to have at least some fans in the stands, it gave some Arkansas fans some hope that that Notre Dame game will happen at Notre Dame. And then obviously the football season as it continued. I've really appreciated how the SEC has handled this. I feel like they've really been very diligent with their research. They've been patient, and they've been kind of a calm person to go to as an entity when you look at the chaoticness of the environment around the countries right now. So I really respect the way the SEC has handled it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's been fantastic. I mean, you know, I've said it 50 times since we've started talking, but the fact that Ross talks every 2 weeks and just gives us what he knows. I mean, sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, I don't know, but it's, you know, that's something we're working on. That's something we're looking into, just to kind of give you, you know, an update and where things are. Whereas, you know, like the Big 12 conference, like what, you know, what's the deal? You know, we kind of knew that this date was coming for the SEC. There's other conferences where you're just trying to figure out, okay, what are they thinking? And I think the transparency from the SEC, be it through, you know, through the athletic directors, I think has been fantastic. And it has been a source of hope for people that, you know, okay, maybe there's nothing new, but here's what we're working on. Here's some of the new challenges that we're trying to overcome, and here's how we're doing it. And I think that just keeping a light on and just keeping it in people's minds that, hey, this is our target date. This is what we're working on. Here's how we plan to get there.
They've been extremely accessible. I think that goes for the entire conference. I know, especially for our 2 ADs we cover here, it sounds like it's the same for all you guys across the SEC. They've just been, like you said, Matt, just very transparent. And that's been so refreshing, because a lot of the time it can feel like trying to get an interview with Darth Vader whenever you try to talk to Nick Saban. It's just very hard to kind of get up the in there, especially at a place like Alabama. But Byrne and Alan Green at Auburn have done such a good job of keeping us updated. I think of it like a spectrum. Okay, we've got the Power 5 conferences. The SEC, I think it's fair to say, has been the most aggressive, most optimistic. They're going to come back. You look at a conference like the Pac-12, maybe hasn't been quite as ambitious with how they want to reopen. But the SEC, and Brian, going back to Scott Woodward, he said, we want to be the leader. I remember him saying that, and that stuck out to me. And now we get news today from UAB's athletic director. They're in the Conference USA, Mark Ingram. He said, we're going to try to follow the same type of plan. So again, the SEC sets the tone, and I think the rest of the country can kind of follow them.
Yeah, I've really been impressed with Greg Sankey and his total office in their communication with us. Remember, LSU, they host Texas. The Longhorns come to Baton Rouge week 2. So that's another big, you know, star by that game, you know, Arkansas, Notre Dame. I think it's a little bit more calming that the partner for this game is a Big 12 team, and already a campus that said they're going to have students in the seats. I believe it's August 26th, somewhere in August, they're going to have students come back to campus at UT Austin. I would hate to probably work in one of the markets in the Pac-12 just because it doesn't seem like they are being as proactive, or, you know, I haven't heard of any task force out west, but and I don't follow them as closely, but it is a little bit more comfortable, I guess, when you've got a partner. It's just the state right over there, and obviously a campus that is expecting to have things somewhat go back to normal.
My last question for you guys, because I know we're all busy. As we talk about football specifically, this deal is for football, men's basketball, women's basketball. I was very surprised baseball was not on that list, considering they lost basically a whole season, or at least 2/3 of their season. Do you think they should have let baseball come back, or baseball be that next sport that they step to after June 30th? Because I know Dave Van Horn down the street is itching to get his guys back.
Yeah, I think it's interesting on how they've handled it in the sports that they did announce that could come back or to do voluntary workouts, being football and men's and women's basketball. Just given football makes sense, obviously, and then men's and women's basketball makes sense because they're revenue generators. But I spoke with a soccer coach at Baylor yesterday, and he's like, we're the first ones to play. Like, we still don't know what we're doing. And I think that may be where they start to look at, okay, who needs to be back on campus first, because soccer, volleyball, cross country, those sports are all going to get going around the same time as football. And specifically speaking to soccer, you know, coach was talking to me yesterday about, yeah, it's going to be the same way in football. Okay, we're back to campus, but how do you socially distance in a contact sport? And so those are things that they have to kind of work through. So I don't necessarily see baseball right now as being a big priority, just because the season has been scrapped and, you know, they're waiting until, you know, January next year. And then you also have the option for kids to, whether they're going to the draft, whether they're playing in, you know, the summer league that's coming down here to Bryan. You know, I would see them maybe focusing on some of the fall sports next, and then kind of following the season beyond that.
It's really the only aspect of this that kind of makes you scratch your head. It feels like, at least optically, they pretty much knocked this out of the park. Like, we've been sitting here talking for 20 minutes. It's been basically all positives, like rainbows and unicorns. That's the one thing where it's like, why did they make that decision? Why can't soccer come back? Why is it only these 3 sports? But again, hoping that we'll get a little more clarity. Keep in mind, guys, June 8th is still 2 weeks away. So maybe they'll just say, hey, let's open the faucet a little bit more. More of these sports can come back, and we just don't know yet. But this, I think, is a great first step.
Yeah, I almost understand the baseball not coming back, because there are summer leagues, and we got one here in Baton Rouge and here in the South. And they can go play in some of these other leagues and still get a lot of their work in. Some of them obviously have futures in Major League Baseball, so you can't really mess with that much. But yes, I think Matt brought up a really good point. Soccer is kind of a head scratcher. You've got, you know, they said that every coach here on campus at LSU has been educated in contact tracing. Well, you know, it kind of goes back to, if you have these young athletes who are at the peak of their performance or peak of their lives as far as physically fit, and you're contact tracing and you're scrubbing everything down, you're making sure that everything is sanitized. It feels like this should be one of the safest places. So why not include, obviously, the sport that starts first? I think that would probably be one of my first questions.
We had someone comment very much like you said, Brian, on our Twitter page on something, and said, you know, as much as what these universities are doing in terms of cleanliness, in terms of wiping things down, tracking, these student athletes might be safer on campus than they are at their own home. So really going to be interested to see how this all kind of plays out. But gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I know we're all busy, so I'll let you get back to it, but hopefully in the near future we can chat again.
Sounds great. It's been awesome.
Thanks,
guys.